In the whole system of American government, there's this really important safety feature, right? A kind of emergency brake that's designed to keep any one branch from getting way too powerful. It's called congressional oversight. But is it actually working? Let's get into it.
So, we're going to start with this really provocative headline from a recent op-ed. It asks a pretty tough question, one that gets super relevant when things get tense, like during a government shutdown. Is Congress, the very body that's supposed to hold everyone else accountable, actually doing its job? And just to give you some context for that do-nothing label, the same article points this out. You've got members of Congress making $174,000 for about 100 days of work a year. Then you have the average American worker who works a lot more for a whole lot less. It's comparisons like this that really fuel that public feeling of a Congress that's just out of touch.
Okay, but before we can even begin to talk about whether Congress is failing, we really have to be clear on what its job is supposed to be. So what exactly is this power of oversight?
So here's the official definition. At its core, it is Congress's job to watch over the executive branch. That's the president and all the federal agencies, to make sure that they're carrying out the laws and policies the way they're supposed to. This isn't about writing new laws. It's about making sure the laws we already have are actually working. And this isn't some newfangled idea. The Supreme Court has backed this up time and time again. They famously said in the Watkins case that the power to investigate is just fundamental to the whole process. Without it, the court basically said Congress would be shooting in the dark, totally unable to pass smart, effective laws. So why does it matter so much? Well, you can think of it as having three main purposes. First, there's the programmatic part, just making sure government programs are running well and doing what they're supposed to do. Then there's a political angle. It's how Congress keeps the public in the loop and gets support for policy changes. And finally, and this is the big one, is the institutional reason. This is the heart of checks and balances. It's how Congress keeps the president's power in check. All right, so if that's the why, then what about the how? How does Congress actually do this? Well, it turns out they have a whole toolbox full of methods for the job.
We all see the committee hearings on TV, right? But the real power, the real teeth, come from some of these other tools. Maybe the biggest one is the power of the purse. Congress literally controls the government's wallet. If they don't like what an agency is doing, they can just cut off the money. And on top of that, they can launch huge investigations and issue subpoenas that have the full force of law.
And this right here, this is a subpoena. This isn't a friendly invitation, it's a legal order. It forces someone to show up and testify or to hand over documents. It's an absolutely essential tool for getting to the truth during an investigation. Okay, so now that we have that foundation, let's go back to that op-ed we started with. It's super important to remember, oversight is almost always political. What one side calls critical oversight, the other is probably going to call a partisan witch hunt. So keeping that in mind, let's look at the specific examples the article brings up. First up, the article claims the president held back money that Congress had specifically set aside for certain programs. Now, this is a huge deal. It's a potential violation of the Impoundment Control Act, which is a law created for the very purpose of stopping a president from just ignoring Congress's spending decisions. So, according to the writer, what did Congress do about this? Nothing. A total lack of action. Next, there's the firing of 17 inspector generals. Now, these are the independent watchdogs inside federal agencies. They're supposed to be nonpartisan, and that the law says Congress has to get a 30-day heads up before they're fired. The article says that didn't happen. And the response from Congress, according to this op-ed? You guessed it. Silence. Another example where the author says Congress just didn't step up. The article also brings up executive orders that supposedly put independent agencies, think the FCC or the SEC, under the direct control of the president. That's a big move because those agencies were specifically set up by Congress to be independent from that kind of political pressure. And Congress's reaction? According to the author, it was nada, nil, and naught. You can really hear the frustration in the writing here. And finally, the article talks about the president's business dealings, which it argues brings up questions about the Emoluments Clause. That's a part of the Constitution that's basically there to stop federal officials from being influenced by gifts or payments from foreign governments. And the congressional response? In the author's one-word summary? Zip. Yeah, the whole sequence really paints a picture of a Congress that, according to this view, has just walked away from one of its key responsibilities. Now, this kind of perceived inaction has real consequences for public trust. This Gallup data, also cited in the article, shows public approval for Congress is at a pretty dismal 23%. That means a whopping 77%, more than 3 out of every 4 Americans, disapprove of the job they're doing.
So here's the bottom line. Why should any of us care? What's really at stake when this whole oversight thing breaks down, no matter which party's in the White House or controlling Congress?
Well, it turns out the risks are pretty huge, and you hear this from constitutional scholars all across the political map. See, when Congress doesn't do its oversight job, it can start this dangerous domino effect. First, it makes it seem normal for the executive branch to overstep its bounds. That, in turn, can lead to unchecked presidential power. And from there, you risk eroding the rule of law itself, which ultimately just weakens the entire democratic system that's built on these checks and balances.
And this really brings us to the core of the issue. The tools are there. The purpose is clear. But none of it matters if there isn't the political will to actually use them. So that leaves us with this massive, critical question for our time. In an era that is this politically divided, how can Congress possibly find a way to do its most basic constitutional job as a check on power?